What is your favorite game of all time? For years I've heard this question and can never actually give an answer, copping out with either 4 or more games tacked onto it because I was very indecisive about what I liked. BlazBlue Central Fiction, The Wind Waker, Yakuza 0, Kingdom Hearts 2, and so many more games would rotate on and off that list as new and better games came out, making it difficult to keep a consistent list throughout the years. However, funnily enough, in that indecision, it told me of one game that I liked more than the others, as I would always find a way to fit it onto the list without a second thought, with that game in particular being Metal Gear Solid 3. Now, it's also funny that I call this game one of my favorites of all time, because when I first played Metal Gear Solid 3, I hated it. Coming off of MGS2, this game was much harder than anything that came before it, and I was not adapting well to this radical change, causing me to skip it and dive right into 4, which, thanks to 3 being a prequel, was very easy to do. Back then, I was a complete casual who only played games as an escape, and as a result, I didn't want to be challenged in any way, shape, and form. So when it asked if I was ready to take it on, I promptly said no. For months, I didn't want to touch this game because I knew I would just get frustrated with it, and then I saw a Let's Play from another YouTuber who was able to adapt to MGS3's difficulty. Seeing him succeed brought my confidence back as I went back into MGS3 and began understanding what it asked of me, and then I beat it, and man, it was an ordeal, but fun nonetheless, with those ending cutscenes cementing in my mind that my decision to come back was worth it. I think out of every game that I've played, MGS3 might have been one of the titles that affected me the most, as after it, I became more open to games that challenged me, as it taught me that in order to beat some games, you first have to understand the mechanics. That sounds like an obvious statement, mostly because it is, but thanks to games getting a lot easier over the years, you'll find effective strategies like button mashing can carry you to the end of an action game without learning a chunk of the mechanics the game has to offer. No judgment, I was doing the exact same thing once upon a time, but thanks to MGS3, I realized that in order to beat a game, I needed to know how to play it, which is a mentality that has seeped into every game I've played, and heck, even into the scripts of these videos, as I can't help but detail all the ways the various mechanics work. Needless to say, MGS3 affected a lot about how I interact with games, and because of that, it has been the reason why it stayed as one of my favorites for so many years. But despite being one of my favorites, I actually haven't played it front to back in quite some time. Almost 10 years in fact according to my save data, so I don't actually know if this game can still hang by my standards today. Let's fix that, as we dive right into Metal Gear Solid 3. The story this time around takes place in the 1960s at the beginning of the Cold War, where both the US and Russia compromised in order to stave off a nuclear holocaust, with the former taking down their IRBMs in Turkey and the latter pulling out of Cuba. Except that actually wasn't the terms of the deal. Just a cover-up on the US side, asked to leave Cuba, the Russians wanted a scientist by the name of Nikolai Stepanovich Sokolov. In events before the story, Sokolov had defected to the West alongside his wife and kid, fearing the completion of a weapon the Russians were having him work on. With no choice in the matter, the US handed over Sokolov, and in his leave, the Russians had began gearing up, performing more and more nuclear tests, causing the US government to become more perturbed at the destruction, as a result getting them to call in a CIA agent to go in and get him back. With both Snake and Raiden not existing in this time frame, we go back to the origin point as a man named Jack takes on the role of Snake this time around, having the surname Naked as thanks to his friend Major Zero, trying to also use the situation to push the yet to be formed Foxhound into the government's point of view, with their soon to be standard procurement on-site policy. For this mission, Jack is accompanied by the aforementioned Major Zero, the advisor, paramedic, the medical specialist, and the boss, the CQC expert. Now, the boss in particular is much more special than just a hand-to-hand combat advisor. As to Jack, she is his mentor who one day disappeared without a word. While the boss explains to Jack that she was called away on a mission, the two can't seem to see eye to eye as Major Zero comes through to break up the lover spat and have Jack continue on with his virtuous mission. Within a matter of minutes, Jack manages to locate Sokolov and take out the guards alongside the hidden Ocelot unit who is being commanded by, you guessed it, Ocelot himself, who after Jack gives him his famous line, he and Sokolov make a break for the rope bridge where they encounter the boss on the other side. Thanks to an old unit called Cobra, they're able to recapture Sokolov as the boss dismantles Jack's gun and breaks his arm, leaving him unable to resist her. Shortly after, the colonel of the GRU, a man named Volgin, appears on the scene wanting to kill Jack now that he's seen his face, but the boss decides to do it herself, tossing Jack off the bridge, telling him to drift away. Volgin then opens a gift the boss gave to him, being a recoilless nuclear warhead, and immediately tests it out on Sokolov's old research facility, killing his own countrymen in the process, which is a level of betrayal that not even Ocelot can understand. Thanks to that loud firework, the Russian President Khrushchev contacts Lyndon B. Johnson, wanting an explanation as to what a US aircraft was doing floating around in Russian airspace. President Johnson denies having any affiliation with it, which Khrushchev finds hard to believe, especially when he hears that the US's best soldier defected to his side, but he provides the US with a way of proving their innocence. The US has 1 week to find and kill the boss, who is now behind Russian lines alongside Volgin, as thanks to Sokolov, he is now close to amassing enough military power to overthrow Khrushchev off his mantle, and more than likely start a nuclear war. With another potential nuclear war on the horizon and the firing squad getting ready to shoot Jack and Major Zero, the two get back into position to enact their next operation, Snake Eater. This is where the game truly begins, as you're given full control of Jack as he sneaks his way into Russia and puts an end to Volgin's plot. So right off the bat, everything you can do in MGS2, you can do also in 3 as well. From ledge hangs, to hold-ups, to leaning and the tiptoe shots, everything is here and accounted for. However, many things have been given slight tweaks to help them adjust to the times the story takes place in, and to see this, you don't have to look further than the new meter under your health bar. So a big part of Metal Gear lore are nanomachines, which apart from letting characters communicate with one another without having to use a radio, also allows the subject to operate without consciously taking care of their bodies while on a mission. However, since MGS3 takes place in the 60s, you don't have that ability, as you now have to manually manage everything you could previously ignore, all of which is represented by the stamina gauge. The stamina gauge is what it sounds like, being a meter that represents Jack's physical strength when it comes to hanging off of ledges or holding his breath underwater. The thing is though, is that the stamina gauge is not only useful to keep track of these things, but it also represents how steady Jack's hands will be while aiming. Now, while on the 4th level, the shake won't be so bad, but the lower and lower it gets, the more Jack's hands will tremble. Not to mention the fact that when depleted to level 2 stamina, Jack's stomach starts growling, which can also alert guards to your presence. Interestingly enough, even though guards can hear your stomach growl, if you jump off a high ledge and break Jack's leg, which causes him to scream, the guards won't notice this for some reason. Anyways, to refill your stamina gauge, you simply kill an animal, collect the item box that drops from it, then head into the food menu and select Eat. Depending on how good the food tastes, it will allow Jack to recover large amounts of the stamina gauge. However, if it happens to taste bad, then the gauge will hardly go anywhere. To find out which animal tastes good, you can either try them out for yourself or talk to paramedic, who will, reluctantly, tell you which animals are considered to be tasty. Keep in mind that she doesn't have great knowledge of which animals are good to eat, thanks to her being more interested in how the creature lives than how it tastes going down your gullet, so some experimenting is required at certain points. With that being said, every type of food item is now dedicated towards filling up your stamina gauge. This includes rations, which were, up until now, the series' primary way of recovering your health bar. But don't fret, as MGS3 still has a way for you to recover your health, the first of which comes in the form of life medicines, which refill your empty life gauge at the cost of your endgame rank. And the second method, which you'll probably be using the most since life meds are kind of rare, requires that you use a stamina gauge in the brand new cure menu. So whenever you get attacked, there is a chance that the blow could have left a red marker on your health bar, which will prevent a certain portion of your health from healing all the way. To get rid of it, head into the cure menu and treat the wound with whatever tools the scenario calls for. Doing so will not only remove the red bar, but increase your health by a small amount, at which point the game will then automatically start refilling your health bar in small increments. There is no way to get the increments to increase, but there is a way to speed it up, which is determined by your stamina gauge, as the higher it is, the quicker the regen, but the lower it is, the slower the regen. If I haven't made it clear enough already, you should never be in a position where the stamina gauge is depleted beyond the 2nd level, as after that, Jack's body will begin impeding how well you perform. Heck, you can't even carry too many weapons on you this time around because they all have their own weight capacity, which can also drain your stamina gauge faster. Now, these changes alone aren't enough to make MGS3 too hard to handle, but these next changes really tip the scales in turning this game into a different beast. The first of these is the ability to procure weapons on site. So, as it's stated by Major Zero in the intro, Foxhound's unique aspect is the fact that they only use weapons found on site. And while this was stated in the past 2 games, this only served as an explanation as to why you had no weapons when starting a mission. In MGS3, however, it's a legit part of the gameplay. The only 2 weapons the game gives you are the M22 and M1911. Everything else is optional and can be ignored if you either aren't thorough enough in your search or just don't care. While this can potentially be detrimental in some boss fights, the game has enough unique methods to beat each boss that you don't have to worry about it. However, this doesn't only apply to weapons, but medical supplies needed to heal you from injuries and ammo too. And while these 2 are big enough on their own, MGS3 takes it a step further by not only making gun suppressors breakable, but forcing you to track them down as well. This singular change to how suppressors work messed me up for the longest time, as now you have to make sure that you're dead on on when you shoot, otherwise you'll have a damaged suppressor for no reason. On top of that, when your suppressor is on its last legs, the final shot you make is loud, causing the enemies in the area to hear it. And if it's on its last legs, you can't replace it for one of your better suppressors you have, as you need to wear it out first before you're even given the option to replace it. All of this combined makes it so you not only have to be more accurate when you're playing MGS3, but you also have to be smart too in order to get around the suppressor's weakness, alongside being fortunate enough to get one of the random drops you get from moving enemies around being the suppressor you need for the specific gun you're using. This was one of, if not the reason as to why I felt MGS3 was too difficult for me on my first time through, as thanks to me only being recently introduced to shooting controls thanks to MGS1 and 2, I wasn't too good at aiming, and now that my inaccuracy was going to be outright punished, it caused a lot of tension to run through me whenever an enemy popped up. It didn't help that now I had to remember to take off the suppressor when I confirmed that no guards were in the area, otherwise I just busted up for no reason when trying to kill a snake for food, or when I'm fighting a boss. In addition to that, MGS3 takes place in a variety of locations, with normal buildings being one of the least utilized locations. A swamp, a forest, and a mountaintop are what you'll be sneaking around, as MGS3 throws at you some of the most unruly locations in the series to date, and because of the terrain, it's extremely hard to spot the guards before they spot you. In combination with the suppressors, this is what makes MGS3 so difficult, as you really can't drop your guard at any point, as when you least expect it, a guard can appear in your blind spot and start an alert phase. To help you out, in the Subsistence release, the devs gave full camera control to the player in addition to the series' staple overhead camera, which you can freely switch between by clicking R3. Full camera controls are amazing for MGS3, as with the somewhat awkward nature of these more natural environments, having a fixed camera when blind spots are literally all over the place can be a huge pain. But with the ability to look around without being forced to stick Jack's neck out, you're given much more leeway in terms of how you look out for guards. But with that being said, it's not a sure fix, as thanks to the original development of the game, some of the areas like the mountains are made with a fixed camera in mind, and as such, it becomes a lot harder to navigate because you can't see from the top down. As a result, you're going to have to experiment with which camera perspective is better for which environment. I'm not kidding when I say the world design of MGS3 is a skill check in and of itself, as no other game in the series has a more difficult terrain to navigate, and on my first time through, I was not ready for this kind of spike in difficulty in the first hour of play. Heck, even now when I know the game better, there are a lot of times where I botch a section or come close to botching it thanks to the odd formations of these natural designs. It didn't help that in the first time in MGS history, the on-site procurement was a genuine gameplay feature where you can straight up miss weapons and not get ammo refills if you don't run into every location with a fine-tooth comb and pat down every guard you knock out. I want you all to know that in the past, I beat MGS3 at least 3 to 4 times already, and during the recording sessions for this video, I ended up being shocked when I found out there were 2 weapons that I'd never seen before, being the handkerchief and the assault rifle. Back in 2004, this design was almost unheard of, and yet here MGS3 is yet again bringing some of the most freeform gameplay where upon multiple playthroughs, you can cut out the fat and only get the weapons that will benefit your specific playstyle. And while this is cool and all, on my first time through, I missed a lot of weapons, which because I was constantly unsure of where enemies were, I was barreling through locations trying not to get spotted, causing me to be light on ammo pretty early on. Needless to say, I was overwhelmed by MGS3's design, as while cool, I had felt that it dropped me off to the wolves and hadn't fully explained all of what I was supposed to be doing. From this part on, you know the rest. I stopped playing, went to MGS4, had a much easier time, and stayed away from 3 until I saw that YouTube video of the better player adapting to the game, and I went back and tried it myself. While the game didn't really become much easier, I think being able to see someone else more skilled at the game allowed me to realize all the mechanics I wasn't using to the fullest, which helped me adapt to the rest of the game from then on out. Now, adaptation is arguably the main mechanic of MGS3, as it not only expects you to adapt to the new gameplay changes, but adapt to your surroundings with the camo index. The camo index is easily the strongest mechanic given to the player yet, as it allows you to blend into your environment so well that you practically become invisible to any and all guards. It's important to note that the camo index is always active, and to make use of it, all you have to do is go into the camo menu and find which getup and face paint bring the number on the top right of the screen closest to 100. The closer the number is to 100, the harder it is for enemies to find you, even if you're right in front of them, making the AI at times seem that they're worse than the genome soldiers in MGS1. But conversely, the farther that number is from 100, the easier it is for enemies to spot you from farther away, at times dunking on the MGS2 guard's vision if your camo index is low enough. In addition to that, where your position in an area also affects the camo index, as standing gives you the lowest numbers, crouching gives you the second highest, and laying down gives you the highest numbers you can hope to reach, with tall grass, trees, and rocks adding to your near invisibility. Whenever you enter into a new room, you should should always consult your camo index, because having a good percentage to high percentage literally stops any guard from spotting you at even point blank range. The camo index is ridiculously good, and one of, if not the main reason why you're able to beat a lot of sections in the game. In fact, because of the camo index, it gives you a lot of advantage over the guards, as while the environment may keep a couple of them concealed, if you stay low, you will always be harder to find. Just be sure not to move over any tall grass, because the guards will notice that. However, that's not the only new thing that MGS3 allows you to adapt to, as with the possibility of you running out of bullets at any time, the devs gave Jack a whole new toolkit to play around with called Close Quarters Combat, or as it's better known, CQC. So, despite the series having a punch button for the longest time, I rarely gave it any shine because of how bad hand-to-hand combat was in comparison to the gunplay. But now that the devs have expanded enough of its uses, it's a genuinely good tool if you're low and or out of ammo. First and foremost, you have your basic punch combo, which is done by mashing circle, but if you instead hold circle while holding any direction, Jack will instead slam the guard to the floor, instantly knocking them out. Unfortunately, the slam is also loud, so if there are any guards nearby, they will hear it. But nevertheless, it's still a very good option if you're running low on supplies. But that's not all, as you can now interrogate people as well by gently holding circle without pressing a direction, and then by pressing L3. Be careful though, as MGS has a weird pressure sensitivity thing going on, where if you press circle hard doing the exact same input, Jack will instead slit their throats, needless to say, giving you no info. This isn't the only pressure sensitive mechanic, mind you, as every gun also functions on a similar control scheme, as, in case you need to put your gun down, lightly holding square will do so, but pressing it heavily will have you shoot no matter what. I never mentioned this up to now because I never noticed that this was a thing, as thanks to MGS1 not having this feature when I needed to put a gun down, I went into the select menu and switched to no weapon, and since the game never tells you that this is a thing in-game, I've kept this habit up for years. Unfortunately, the lack of clarity also shows itself in CQC too, as, unless I missed something, the game doesn't tell you how to properly do any of this, despite the fact that there is a section really early on where it's almost necessary to CQC someone in order to get by without sounding any alarms. In addition, the AI's hearing is much better in 3 to boot, so you can't slightly tilt the analog stick to sneak up on them. Instead, you need to use the D-pad, which for whatever reason makes Jack's footsteps a lot quieter. A lot of this is explained in the manual for the game, however, the explanation isn't always clear. Like with the D-pad, there's no explicit statement that your footsteps will be any quieter, it just says that it's used for stalking, which I mean, is something, but there's no implication in the booklet that implies that the analog stick is any louder. Odd omissions aside, this doesn't stop MGS3 from being extremely detailed when it comes to the world as a whole, as Jack's auditory support will fill you in on just about everything you need to know about a situation. In fact, these three are so detailed that I think they're the best support team in Metal Gear games yet. From Paramedic's almost insatiable love of movies to Signet being freaked out by Jack's odd love of boxes, this trio is easily my favorite in just the sheer amount of range of emotions and odd situations the game puts them into. But with that being said, for me, Paramedic sticks out the most, as thanks to her interactions with Jack when you manage to hunt down a new animal. Medic begins every codec call by talking about interesting animal facts, and Jack doesn't care, only being interested in how good it tastes. It's a very straightforward joke, but it just makes me laugh every time I hear it thanks to how childish Jack sounds about getting his food factoids. The detail doesn't end there, as in true Metal Gear fashion, 3 is packed to the brim with easily missable aspects. However, just like on-site procurement, all of what's in 3 is genuine mechanics. From destroying ammo and food caches to either give enemies less firepower or starve them out, allowing them to be easier to take down, or like when Jack has to travel through a series of dark caves, and how the game screen will eventually adapt to the darkness like a person's eyes, allowing you to see what was previously pitch black. MGS3 is filled to the brim with eyebrow-raising mechanics that, after all these years, still manage to surprise me with how meticulous the devs were for detail. But the one place in the game where I think I can see the most detail is with the boss fight against the end, thanks to the myriad of ways the game allows you to take him down. So, for context, this boss fight against the end is a sniper fight in which you can only use the SVD you potentially got earlier in the game to meet him in a sniper duel, or you can be all stealth-like and sneak up behind him with the M22 for a no-kill strat. If you use the latter, the end will try and hit you with a stun grenade to try and escape, and if he's close to you and hits an area transition, you're in luck because he's normally close by, but if he gets away, not all is lost as you can follow his footprints in the dirt. Be careful though, as not only will rain start pouring if you take too long to track his prints, but he will also purposely lead you into a clearing so he has a clear shot at you. However, if you want to find the end and have the easiest path to him, you can always track down and capture his parakeet, which upon release, it will fly back to its master in an area he isn't watching. But don't be too long about it, because the end will over time regenerate his stamina, potentially wasting all the work you put in for a non-lethal victory. And if all of that wasn't enough, this entire boss fight spans 3 different areas which has multiple sniping spots for the end to occupy. And in addition, he's just as camouflaged as you are, with the only thing giving him away being the reflection of his scope. When you lay all this out on paper, the end sounds like a boss fight that should be absolutely dreadful. But in practice, it turns out to be a pretty fun game of hide and seek with a ton of different mechanics to make seeking so much easier. But that's not all, as in a much earlier section where if you headshot the end with the SVD, you don't fight him in his boss arena, but the grunts of the Ocelot faction. But if all that's too much for you, then you can set your system clock to 2 weeks ahead of time and the end will die from old age, making for a very anticlimactic fight, but effective if you're looking to save on time. But you should keep in mind that if you do this, you run the risk of tainting all the food you hunted, as MGS3's in-game clock determines whether or not food will spoil. And if said food spoils, then Jack gains a greater risk of getting sick from it if you choose to have him eat that food. The end is such a cool and layered fight that even amongst the rest of MGS3's amazing design, it stands out with how open-ended it is to approach. And for such an interesting boss fight, you're actually given a handful of interesting rewards for beating him. The first of which you'll easily get from doing a non-lethal fight is a sniper rifle, the Mosin, which is the only non-lethal sniper rifle in the game, which you'd think would be super useful in a non-lethal run, but I rarely found a good place to use this thanks to the endgame guards being closely corralled together. But that aside, sneaking up and holding the end at gunpoint after a while will force him to give you his very own camo called Moss, which is not only super useful for his boss fight, but for the rest of the game as well. Now, the end isn't the only boss that gives you something exclusive from using non-lethal tactics, as every boss in the game will drop their camo if you don't kill them, with the end being the one exception to the rule. But with that being said, some camo are better than others, as the Fierce Spider camo might actually be the best one in the game thanks to its absurdly high percentage in just about every scenario. However, as a cost, the camo drains your stamina like no tomorrow, so be careful about when you use it. Interestingly enough though, unlike MGS2 where I'd say there's really no need to use lethal weapons if you don't feel the need to, MGS3 gets actively harder in certain areas if you decide to spare every enemy you come across, as the M22's fire rate slowly starts catching up to you in the more hectic sections. While I did have a bit of trouble aiming in the more high-octane chase sections near the end of the game, nothing can compare to the sheer difficulty of taking on the Fury with a trank. The Fury is a boss where you and him are stationed in a dark room with 5 different hallways, with the both of you having the ability to attack each other from either end. But in the Fury's case, his flamethrower has a much wider range of attack than your guns. At first, it's not bad since the Fury can't see to the other end of the hall, but once you hit the halfway mark, the Fury starts going wild, blindly firing into the hallways and using his jetpack to now clear distance in a matter of seconds, and then use that jetpack to hop around to a different hallway, making it hard to predict where he'll land next. If you're using lethal methods, you have claymores and guns with a faster rate of fire, so you can set him and forget him, or just punish the Fury for going wild and shoot him good. But with non-lethal weapons, you have the M22 or SVD for this fight with a painfully long reload time, and thanks to the Fury's wild attack patterns, it can be hard to get a hit on him without getting burned. It also doesn't help that thanks to the Fury's movement going from bad to great in the different elevations of the hallways, it makes the Raider near useless for finding out his position. However, not all's lost, as you can use the gaps in between the hallways to hide and either hit the Fury in his blind spot or use it for a quick escape when he shoots down a hallway. It sounds simple to execute, but in practice, thanks to the Fury's unpredictability, it's hard to consistently execute, with the M22 needing to be reloaded per shot, forcing you to be super accurate in a super small window or just get burned. The Fury is probably the hardest boss when it comes to a non-lethal run, as the other bosses in the game aren't too difficult under these stipulations, but the Fury has such a sharp spike in difficulty that it's hard not to mention. Speaking of spikes in difficulty on a non-lethal run, I find it super odd that enemies on hovercrafts essentially can't be touched by you, otherwise it counts as a kill. While this isn't an issue for a majority of the game as they rarely appear, in the final chase section when they make another appearance, you can't touch them at all even with non-lethal weapons, otherwise the crash will count towards your kill count, in which case if you do nothing and let them crash into the wall at the end of the section, the game will oddly enough not count it towards your kill count. I bring this up because it's super unintuitive to the player, seeing as these biker enemies, despite seemingly suffering a similar fate, don't count as a kill, and it's so deep into the game that it can ruin a non-lethal run if you aren't privy to this information beforehand, which why would you be unless you've already failed a non-lethal run in the past? Which I have, and it wasn't a very fun thing to realize. What was fun to realize though is that in this particular game, the espionage aspect of the series' tagline, Tactical Espionage Action, was given a lot more play, as with things like different disguises and masks you can don, new maneuvers like CQC interrogation, and various tropes like recorded messages self-destructing that make this adventure feel closer to a spy movie. While the writing was always on the wall, I didn't pick up on this beforehand thanks to my lack of experience in the genre, and while I haven't exactly become much more knowledgeable of spy movies, seeing as I haven't seen one in years, having fresh eyes while watching an old adventure make things a lot easier to spot. Now, while MGS3 takes a similar route to 2 in having a majority of its cast lie to the audience about where their loyalty lies, it provides enough context clues for the player to pick up on and get an assumption of what's going on and who's playing for what team. This gives MGS3 that tension that spy movies thrive off of in just about every cutscene during the end game, as you only have an idea of who's actually here to help Jack and don't know if and or when they plan to double cross him. It also helps that 3 doesn't have a gigantic twist where you can't possibly predict it before the end game, being a relatively straightforward tale, so it's a lot easier to process what's going on even when the situation gets a bit more complicated. The idea of loyalty, specifically a soldier's loyalty to their country, is a major theme that MGS3 digs into, as it asks the question, how far can you stretch a soldier before their loyalty wears thin? There are 3 major characters that interact with this theme throughout the game, being the major villain of this adventure, Vulcan, the greatest soldier in history, the boss, and the man who needs to define where his loyalties lie, Jack. Starting off with the villain, Vulcan is just about as far removed as you can get from being called a soldier despite the fact that he's the colonel of the group. Vulcan has no loyalty to the Russian government as he tries to amass enough power to overthrow their head of office, and he's got no loyalty to his countrymen as the first chance he gets, he nukes them without even a second thought. There are only 2 people that Vulcan is shown to give any kind of loyalty to in the entire game, being him and himself, with everyone else being worthless pawns that he can break whenever he feels like, with the exception being for the boss, who is the only person that Vulcan is shown to be afraid of. As a result, Vulcan does whatever he wants, to whoever he wants, whenever he feels like, forcing everyone else to watch, as thanks to their loyalty, they're bound to play by their roles and stay in their lane, all the while he goes off the rails and does whatever he pleases. Because of this, Vulcan feels like a dictator in control of his own country, forcing others to bend the knee through violence and ranks, while the latter to him is almost meaningless when it comes to who he's supposed to serve. I gotta say, when comparing Vulcan to the last 2 villains, he comes across as a lot more monstrous than the others in a regular basis. Aside from casually nuking his countrymen without warning, Vulcan beats up on Eva for fun. He loves to torture people, so much so that he kills at least 2 people in the story before he can actually get any worthwhile information out of them, and he's got a temperament of a 4-year-old needing to immediately punch something if someone tells him any bad news. All this coupled together gives way for the most uncomfortable torture scene in the series, when Vulcan catches Jack and tries to extract information out of him. It's never fun watching a man who can't fight back being beaten senseless by someone who's clearly enjoying the violence, but I will say that it's scenes like this that highlight MGS3's amazing choreography, as the game is now able to accurately display levels of violence without having to rely on its gameplay to do so. I think above all else, the worst part of Vulcan is his lack of humanity, as while the last 2 villains had at least a thought about helping someone else, Vulcan's goal only satisfy himself, as he wants to unify the world through fear of his power, as he needs the Shagohod, the first Metal Gear, to show off said power. The boss, on the other hand, plays the opposite role, being the loyal soldier until the end, even to her own detriment. So, to give context to what I mean, the boss's defection was actually a ploy from the US government so that they can get their hands on the Philosopher's Legacy, a microfilm that told the locations of funds that the US, USSR, and China had pulled together to fight in World War II, which had gotten stolen and put into secret bank accounts around the world. Unsurprisingly, Vulcan had inherited the legacy thanks to his father being in charge of the funds, and thanks to that, the boss needed to get close to him, with the only way the government can think of doing so was to have her defect and gain his trust. The ultimate goal of getting the legacy is to bring back unity to the world by reuniting the philosophers who, after World War II, began fighting amongst themselves, eventually resulting in the Cold War, splitting the world to the East and West. With a country's enemies changing with the times, the boss wants to live in a world where people can live in harmony with other people, but without a firm structure that knows the differences between good and evil, the higher-ups will keep perpetuating situations that call for war. And thanks to Vulcan being so impulsive in firing that nuke earlier, the US government was forced to answer Khrushchev's call when he demanded that they prove their innocence, having Jack run in and kill both the boss and Vulcan, with her silently accepting her new role that she'd been given. The boss takes her duty as a soldier very seriously, holding her loyalty to her country above even her own personal feelings. In fact, in events before the story, she was ordered to kill Desaro, a member of her own team and the father of her child, and the boss did so without batting an eye. To the boss, fulfilling her duty as a soldier means more to her than anything in the world. She is, in a lot of ways, the very definition of a soldier, a woman whose sole purpose is to fulfill her role no matter the cost. Even if she comes out of the mission looking like a villain and no one knows of the sacrifices that she had to make, the boss would make them without even a second thought. As in her servitude to her country, she has given up on treating her life as her own, completely submitting herself to being a tool for the government's aid. This is something that she tries to get Jack to understand early on in the game, and that loyalty to one's country is not the same to being loyal to a specific higher up, who can be rolled in and out of office. But despite saying that he'll follow whoever the top brass is, he can't understand why the boss left him so suddenly. The path that the boss walks on is something that is super unique for the series, as despite the large roster of legendary heroes, she is the only one who fought for her own country, even to her own detriment, which takes a large amount of willpower that is unimaginable for the average soldier to conceive. However, similar to Liquid, the boss's self-sacrifice didn't really serve her in the grand scheme of things, as she, despite her ultimate goal in following her orders, would end up helping out Volgin, who is the exact type of person that the boss doesn't want to hold any kind of governmental power. It's a really unfortunate reality of the boss's character, as despite being so cool, she ends up perpetuating her own problem. Not to mention she more or less helps create the Patriots in GW, which is an entirely different can of worms. However, outside of her patriotism, the boss does have one personal goal she hopes to achieve during the adventure, and that is to see Jack grow up into the man she knows he can be. This then brings us to our final character, Jack, and how throughout the game he's been caught in between ideals of what it means to be loyal to a country and loyal to a person. From that same conversation where the boss explains to Jack why she left without a word, we see how Jack is unable to separate the two kinds of loyalty, as he all but outright asks why she wasn't loyal to him just as she was loyal to her country. To Jack, the boss is a mother figure who has given him literally everything in his life, so to find out that his mom had skipped out on him for 5 years without saying a word and doesn't feel like it's a big deal is a lot for him to handle mentally, and unfortunately he wasn't ready to hear what she had to say. Needless to say, Jack was acting pretty immature, which is honestly a blessing and a curse, as this said immaturity is the very reason why he's such a fun character to follow throughout the story, as he drops some of the most surprisingly simple-minded lines, who for a man who shares Solid Snake's voice is the last thing you'd expect to hear. Jack stays this way until the boss betrays him and tosses him off the rope bridge, in which, after getting a nice threat by the firing squad, he comes back to the field with a changed mindset. Well, Jack isn't exactly gung-ho of killing the boss, and vice versa from the boss's perspective, as when Volgin pummels him, she has to leave the room to keep herself together. Nevertheless, he's made up his mind to serve his country and to be the soldier that the boss was talking about. From here, we see Jack grow up a bit, as he still retains a lot of his childish antics, but he isn't as naive as he used to be, no longer being caught with his pants at his ankles when the boss shows up to stop him. While he never gets the upper hand on her, the fact that he can eventually get to the point where he can fight the boss with no questions asked shows a lot about his mental development from the beginning of the game. Not to mention, despite losing in each encounter, Jack progressively gets better at fighting the boss. This then leads us right into the final fight in the game, where Jack is fully grown enough to the point where he can listen to what the boss is saying without interjecting. Whether or not Jack agrees to the boss's ambitions, we don't know, and he doesn't have the time to figure it out, as he calls MIG pilots to bomb the place in 10 minutes, setting the stage for their final encounter. This final fight takes place in a field of white flowers and starts out with no music, but as the timer gets closer to 0, the game's main theme, Snake Eater, begins playing. First the instrumental part, then the full lyrical version. The fight against the boss herself is pretty straightforward, as she only has two methods of attacking, the first being from her gun, the Patriot, and the second being a CQC throw. The gunfire isn't hard to avoid thanks to the field of flowers allowing you to throw off the boss's vision with the correct camo, but the throw on the other hand can be a bit tricky to deal with, as in order to counter it, you have to use your own CQC throw against hers when the red exclamation point appears. It is, in essence, a quicktime event, but at the same time, it beautifully captures Jack's growth, as he finally picked up on the one aspect of the boss's fighting style that he constantly got smoked by, being the fact that she almost always waited for him to make the first move, allowing her to counter whatever he threw out. All of which is shown and not told to the player at all, which is saying something, because if there's one game series I want to tell you about even the most minute details it has, it's Metal Gear. For as sad as this fight is, it's also beautiful in an odd way, as everything about this fight comes together to portray the boss's sacrifice for Jack, and how through this whole ordeal she had set him up to become a better soldier than her. When the boss finally loses the strength to stand, Jack takes her gun and after a long pause kills her, completing his mission and clearing the US's name. And after a brief quarrel with Ocelot, Jack and the double agent helping him throughout the game named Eva fly off to Alaska, where they celebrate their victory and live happily ever after, for about one night. When Jack wakes up the next morning, he finds that Eva disappeared, leaving behind a recorded message and a picture saying goodbye. To make a long story short, Eva told Jack everything about the boss and herself, detailing about how her defection and her death were all a mission given to the former by the US government, while the latter was actually a spy for China looking to get her hands on the legacy so China can be a world power alongside the US and USSR. In an undisclosed amount of time, Jack makes his way back to the White House, where he's given a badge for his duty and given a title above the boss. And while his friends in Foxhound celebrate his accomplishment, Jack leaves, going on his way to visit the boss's grave, giving her one final salute as he begins the next phase of his life as Big Boss. And in an after credit scene, we hear Ocelot talking to the chief director of the KGB, whispering sweet nothings into his ear, as he then makes a phone call to the director of the CIA, as he reveals that he and Eva were working with them the whole time, and after confirming that the legacy is safely in the US's hands, he hangs up up, starting the cycle that eventually leads to Solid, Liquid, Solidus, and Raiden. And that was Metal Gear Solid 3, a game that, after playing again, I'm absolutely sure that it's one of the best games ever made. Similar to the other Metal Gear games, there's something that's oddly timeless about MGS3, where despite all the years it's been since its release, it's just as good now as it was then. But unlike its predecessors, it makes the most of what it has to create what is the best stealth game on the PS2 and the best game in Metal Gear's lineup. Now, that's not to say that it's an exact downward slope from here on out, as each game after 3 has their own unique spin that still makes them worth playing, but those are topics for another day. With that being said, I appreciate you all watching this video, and I hope to see you all again next time. Until then, take care.